I am the South East representative for the Nursing Support Worker Committee here at the RCN. So if any of you are nursing support workers, we have a dedicated page on the RCN website. So please do look us up, and if you want to contact us at any point, then please do that. We're here today at the Royal College of Nursing to give you a part of our exhibition on the history of nursing support workers. So I don't know if you've all been downstairs, those in the room, but it's a really interesting exhibition. I do advise you to go and have a look if you haven't already been down there. So we just need to do a bit of housekeeping. For those in the room, a short note on housekeeping. There are no planned fire alarms tests. So if the alarm does sound, please exit the building through the nearest fire exit to your left at the back of the room. The muster point is inside Cavendish Square. If you do need the toilet at any point, you go through the doors to your left and down one flight of stairs. Okay, and those on Zoom, you will be muted throughout the event. There will be an opportunity after the talks to ask questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. If you are having trouble with Zoom, let us know in the chat. A member of RCN staff will be checking it throughout. And finally, I can introduce the wonderful Dr. Sue Hawkins.
Well, good evening, everybody here and everybody online. Hi, if you can see me, I don't know if you can. And thank you, Sharon, for introducing me. So, VAD, what image do these three letters conjure up for most people? Probably gallant nurses risking their lives in France to mend British troops in the trenches, perhaps. Perhaps you've heard of Vera Brittain in her marvellous memoir, Testament of Youth, or the BBC drama, The Crimson Field, where the action was set in a field hospital in northern France during the First World War. This is rather a narrow view of this cohort known as VADs. What I hope to do this evening is help broaden this perspective and shatter some of the myths that are around them. I'm going to focus on a particular group of women in a small Pennine mill town who came together during the First World War under the auspices of a Red Cross Voluntary Aid Detachment to create a hospital from scratch, from which they provided invaluable aid to injured soldiers. The place was Holmfirth, and by the end of the war, upwards of 70 women from all classes in Holmfirth society had been involved in the enterprise. Later on, we will meet these women in detail, but before that, I want to give you some background on VADs, both the institution itself and its members, and confusingly, the mnemonic VAD is used to describe both. So you have to work out for yourselves which one I'm talking about. It's fairly obvious. So next slide, please, Sarah. An introduction to VAD detachments. They were first established in August 1909 by the War Office in conjunction with the British Red Cross. Excuse me. In the aftermath of the Second World War, in the aftermath of the Second Anglo-Boer War, which had concluded some 8 years previously, and their chaotic support to troops during that war caused a complete re-evaluation of military medical support services. In particular, despite the establishment of a new Army Nursing Reserve, they were worried, the government and military particularly, about a shortage of nurses should war return. As a result, the War Office charged British Red Cross and the St John's Ambulance with devising a system of supplementary aid to the military medical service to be activated in the event of war. The main role of the newly named Voluntary Aid Detachments was to prepare for potential war, laying down preparations for transport of injured, identification of places which could act as clearing stations, and the establishment of military hospitals, or auxiliary military hospitals, I should say. Detachments were organised along gendered lines, as you would expect in the early 20th century. Male detachments took responsibility for infrastructure, transport, erection of hospitals, etc., while the female detachments were responsible for the care of the soldiers, running railway rest stations, providing tea and meals for the injured soldiers as they were moved around the country. They were also expected to provide care to the injured soldiers who passed through their regions or stayed in their hospitals, and all members were required to undertake a brief course in first aid, while the women also underwent tuition in home nursing and invalid cookery. Women and men were recruited to the voluntary aid detachments run by the Red Cross branches around the country, and within 12 months there were over 6,000 female members. I don't have the numbers for the men, I'm afraid. The Order of St John was also empowered to raise a similar voluntary movement, and gradually the roles and duties of the VADs expanded, from simple first aid and nursing duties to include ambulance drivers, chefs, administrative roles, and all sorts of other things, as we will see. This table, bottom, shows how popular the organisation became. Immediately prior to outbreak of war, there were nearly 2,400 detachments with over 70,000 members spread across the country. 2/3 of these were women. So even before war broke out, thousands of men and women were beavering away, making plans for the possibility of war, learning first aid, basic learning skills, laying plans to convert local community halls and private homes into temporary hospitals for the sick and injured. Next slide, please. An article in the Times from the 22nd of June 1914, immediately before the outbreak of war, gives a feel for the type of preparation detachments were undertaking. And I apologise for the somewhat blurred images here. The Times reported a fierce battle taking place near Weybridge. Planes whirled high in the sky while troops fought valiantly, but were beaten back by enemy invaders. What was this? An invasion by German troops that we'd not heard about before the war had even been declared? No, it was the Surrey Red Cross volunteers demonstrating their readiness for invasion at Brooklands racetrack. Organised by their commandant, Ethel Locking, the War Games of June 1914 saw local Red Cross detachments erecting hospitals, rest station, an advanced stationary hospital and a base hospital on the racetrack to receive and treat the wounded. The racetrack became a battleground. Hospitals were so realistic that the whole area presented a scene that brought war conditions vividly to the eye. Over 600 Red Cross members took part in the exercise. Aeroplanes spotted the wounded, directed the ambulances to them, which ferried them up the chain to the clearing hospital and by way of a rest station to the base hospital where the nurses practiced their first aid. The event was a great success. The Times article claimed this was the first such demonstration of Red Cross work through the country had seen, but descriptions of similar field days, even if on a much smaller scale, can be found in the newspapers going right back to 1910. And the image to the right of here is a selection of photographs from a similar event held at Kempsford in Gloucestershire in 1912. The field days were an opportunity for local detachments to parade their skills and preparedness for war to their local communities, and presumably to encourage recruitment at the same time. This nationwide enthusiasm was validated by outbreak of war in August, just a couple of months later. Membership of the detachments then surged as people rushed to volunteer their services in patriotic fervour, and as the men trooped out of the country to the front, their womenfolk trooped to village halls and makeshift hospitals to sew, knit, roll bandages, cook, nurse and carry out numerous other tasks in vast numbers. By the end of the war, there were over 4,000 detachments with nearly 250,000 members, and the majority of VADs worked within the UK, although the more adventurous volunteered for postings overseas, such as those with the British Expeditionary Forces in France and other countries. Next slide, please, Sarah. Before going any further, I just want to give you briefly a bit of information about the sources I've used for this talk, because it's quite important. By the end of the war, as I've said, there were thousands of people who'd offered their services through the Red Cross and St John's Ambulance, and it was decided that, like military personnel, their invaluable contribution should also be recognised. But a major obstacle to this was presented. Central HQ in London had no idea who the volunteers were in the local detachments. So they had to hurriedly create a system for collecting this information. They created pre-printed index cards, which were mailed out to local commandants to be completed and then returned to HQ. Many of these were actually completed. Not all were returned to HQ in London, but a significant number were. And the result is an archive of over 250,000 cards containing brief details of every VAD whose contribution was reported to London. The cards are still in existence, and the collection is held at British Red Cross HQ in London. Some years ago, it was digitised and made available to the public through the Red Cross website, vad.redcross.org.uk. And I'm proud to say I was involved in that project, and we had a very large number of volunteers working on it, which I thought was very fitting considering what we were recording. It's in this collection which has helped shed light on who these people were who volunteered and develop a much more nuanced picture of them than the one I painted at the beginning. The large majority of cards were for women, but perhaps surprising anyone who thought VADs were a female organisation, nearly 17% were male. Of the women, 2/3 of them were single. The cards provide some detail as to the duties undertaken by the members, and as I've already said, they did all sorts of things. But they show that nearly 70,000 of them were nurse members. And I must point out, this doesn't mean they're professional trained nurses, then called nursing members, and all they've done is a first aid course on the whole. There are some trained nurses, but not very many. But that leaves over 120,000 people who are not nurse members and instead carried out this myriad of other roles. There are dispensers, pharmacists, X-ray and lab assistants, cooks, cleaners, fetchers and carriers. They did an inordinate amount of knitting and sewing, worked in clerical and admin roles, were drivers and collected sphagnum moss for dressings in Ireland. VADs organised and ran stores, worked as searchers trying to locate those missing in action, acted as stretcher bearers and manned or womaned rest stations, among many other duties. And they aged in range from school children to the elderly. The inset on this slide, you don't need to be able to read it. It just shows a snapshot of the database which we've created from the cards and which has formed the basis for this talk. Next slide, please, Sarah. So this is some examples of the cards, and they are the cards for the oldest VAD in the collection, Jane Holiday, and the youngest, Ruby Vale. Jane was a retired and widowed teacher who joined the VADs as soon as war was declared and stayed right to the bitter end. Her record records she was 89. It doesn't say when, but probably at the end of the war, judging by her census return in 1911. And the thing I love about Jane is she knitted as many pairs of socks as she possibly could. I said it doesn't say how many, which I would really have liked to know, but never mind. Young Ruby was also a knitter, which she did at school. Like Jane, she stuck to the task throughout the war. Her card says 8 next to her name, but census research suggests she was 6 in 1914 and must therefore have only been about 10 at the end of the war. So she was doing this work as a tiny, almost toddler. It's pretty amazing. These cards, both sides of the card were used to record the information, give an idea of the type of information collected. So we've got on the front name, address, title, dates of joining and leaving, duties undertaken, hours worked, previous engagements, if any, and honours awarded. And on the back, there's more of the same, really. Sometimes they use the back to elucidate more about the individual concerned. So more information about duties, achievements and service and the branch that they are actually working for. Next slide, please, Sarah. Although I'd love to talk to you now about the knitters and the sphagnum moss collectors because I find them fascinating, we are at the RCN this evening and my brief was nursing assistants. So for the rest of this talk, I'll focus on VAD nursing members. Until quite recently, most historical accounts of the VADs have made 3 major assumptions about nursing VAD members. Firstly, they're all female, which I've already shown to be inaccurate. Well, the VADs anyway, the nursing members, almost all were female, but not quite. And they were all nurses. This is about the VADs themselves, which ignores the other 160 plus who did other things, which I've at least acknowledged they existed. The second assumption frequently applied to VAD nurses is that they all did their service in France or elsewhere abroad. Again, this is an extremely narrow view. Only 8,000 or so of those cards we looked at earlier record any service in France or abroad. And out of a total of 70,000 plus VAD nursing members, so that's a very small percentage that actually went to France. While their stories might be more exciting, they're not really representative of the experience of most VAD members who did their service in Blighty. The third common assumption is that VAD nursing members were uniformly middle class, or even upper middle class. Certainly, there were some very well-connected women in the ranks. We have a sprinkling of duchesses, countesses, and one princess, not to mention at least 400 honourables. This view of VAD nurses also appears to have been dominant during the war. In her hints to VAD members in hospitals, you can see on the slide here, E.C. Barton, who was matron at Victorian London, which was one of the largest military hospitals in the capital, alludes to tensions between trained nurses and the assumed socially superior VADs, constantly reminding her VAD readers that regardless of their position in society, in the hierarchy of the military hospital, they were the lowest of the low, where no work should be regarded as menial or beneath their dignity. As she says, the woman who is mistress in her own home is accustomed to be obeyed by all in the household and to do what she has to do at her own convenience in her own way. But the moment she takes up hospital duties, her work is apportioned, superintended, inspected, criticised, and must be done at stated times and in a defined way. Throughout the hints, Barton reminds VADs that even if they hold certificates in first aid or home nursing, this does not make them in any way comparable to the professional nurses they work alongside. And it is this last assumption that I want to really investigate in this talk, this assumption of class in particular. The table of contents from the book is quite handy in that it gives an indication of the type of work VAD nurse members might be asked to undertake. In addition to dusting and cleaning and other tedious tasks, she may be asked to undertake bed making, make general observation of patients, take temperatures, pulse, respirations, use hot water bottles, ice bags, fomentations effectively, and give medicines always according to instruction. Next slide, please, Sarah. So that gives you a sort of feel for what has been written about VADs on the whole. And I think this document that I was referring to has influenced quite a lot of writing about VADs. But what we're going to find out, perhaps, is that things might be a bit different. So this is leading me to the focus of this talk. A detachment of VADs in a small West Yorkshire mill town whose experiences help to broaden this assumed view. There are no famous celebrity nurses in this story, just a group of dedicated women determined to do their bit for the war effort. I've lent heavily on the VAD database already discussed, alongside a rich local archive collection, the Tolson Museum in Huddersfield, to produce this portrait of a local auxiliary hospital. And without those two, it would have been impossible to prepare this. The place is Holmfirth, possibly familiar to you if you remember Last of the Summer Wine, where it was set. And it's situated in the Home Valley. I hope that map might be a little bit too small. I apologise for that. Just south of Huddersfield. We're in West Yorkshire. Huddersfield is sort of towards the southwest. You've got Leeds and Bradford, a bit further north and east, Sheffield below. So they're just south of Huddersfield, really as you're getting into the serious Pennines. And I would like you to look at the contours around, but you possibly can't see, but maybe you can see. It's quite hilly area, yeah? You can see all the contours around it. I'd like you to remember that when we talk about things a bit later on. In 1911, Holmfirth had a population of just under 9,000, so it's a small town. And it was served by a railway, and its economy is dominated, as you would expect, by woolen mills. It was a relatively remote place, even though it had a railway connection. In September 1914, a local doctor organised a first aid class for volunteers in the town, and 127 women attended, including Frances Roberts, the wife of a leading local mill owner. She was also a trained nurse who had worked as a district nurse in Huddersfield before her marriage. So it's likely she was there to help Dr. Williams deliver their class rather than to learn from it. 100 of the 127 women achieved a first aid certificate after passing this class, which was a good result for them. Next slide, please, Sarah. So Frances and her sister-in-law, Emily, who had attended the first aid class, who wasn't a professional nurse, and supported by Dr. Williams, then had the idea of setting up a small hospital for wounded soldiers in Holmfirth and staffing it with the successful attendees of the first aid course. The proposal was enthusiastically taken up by the great and the good of the town. Appeals were put out in the local press for assistance, asking for both money, materials, and premises with which to realise this plan. Clearly, in Holmfirth, they had not been planning for this since 1909. This was something that they decided to do in 1914, and they did it from scratch. And only 2 months after that first aid class was run, the Holmfirth Auxiliary Hospital was up and running and receiving its first casualties. And what we have here on this slide is a picture of Emily and Frances on the left, a picture of, we'll get on to Matron Roberts in a minute with outside the house, but the terrace on the right-hand side is a picture of the terraced house that was loaned to the community as a hospital by the Tinkers. Frances was a trained nurse and she was appointed matron of the hospital, and Emily doubled up as sister and quartermaster, in other words, in charge of supplies. The hospital became somewhat of a pet project for the women of the Roberts family. In addition to Frances and Emily, Edith, sister to their husbands, and May, Emily's daughter-in-law, were also enticed to undertake nursing duties on the wards. There is even evidence that Frances's young daughter, Eileen, who would have been about 3 years old when the war broke out, could be found in the hospital entertaining the soldiers and rolling bandages. And you can see her in this photograph in the middle. She's sitting on the knee of the soldier on the left-hand side, her mother looking on to make sure that she behaves herself. And it's clear that she actually, this isn't a one-off, that there are letters that have been sent to the matron by patients who have recovered and left. And they write to the matron, and amongst other things, they ask how Eileen is, because apparently she's been quite poorly, and so they're asking after her state of health, which shows that she wasn't just there for that photograph, she was there a lot. I like the idea of her rolling bandages, brilliant. In addition to the Roberts family, other local luminaries lent their support. The hospital's management committee was made up of the daughters and wives of local mill owners and other businessmen. Further support in kind was generously offered, not least the loan by Charlie Tinker of the terrace house, just on the outskirts of Holmfirth, as we'll see later. His wife took on the role of treasurer to the management committee in the early days, and other support came in the form of discounts on gas charges from the local gas company. Can you believe this? I found this very hard to understand in today's light. Exemption from rates by the Urban District Council, free use of land adjacent to the terrace. If you look at the terrace, beyond the terrace where the trees are is quite a large field, and they were given free use of that if they needed it in the future for expansion huts, and a free supply of coal from another branch of the Tinker family. The hospital opened on the 12th of November with just 6 beds. Next slide, please, Sarah. This hospital was not unique. I don't want you to think away thinking the people in Holmfirth were unique by any chance. When war broke out, the War Office was flooded with offers from public bodies and private individuals to establish auxiliary hospitals in their local neighbourhoods. In all, more than 5,000 buildings were offered immediately after the war started, most of which came with local funding and staff included, so the War Office had no costs involved in these buildings. At least 3,000 of those proposals were put into action, and the hospitals were staffed by volunteer VAD nurse members, and at least one qualified trained nurse was also required, usually to take the role of matron and to supervise the activities of the other women who had only done a one-day first aid course, but were now populating the hospital. Patients were in the main, though not seriously ill. Most patients had been at one of the major military hospitals to which the auxiliary hospitals were attached. And once their patients in the military hospitals were recuperating well enough, they would then be sent out to the auxiliary hospitals for continuing care. By the end of the war, auxiliary hospitals could be found in all corners of the UK and Northern Ireland, and they provided at least 200,000 beds. And as this slide shows, they came in all shapes and sizes, so you can think of the one in Holmfirth, quite a small terrace. But you can see here, they come in quite different sizes. We've got a largish private house in Cheam in Surrey. We've got a terrace or some sort of cottage, rather a grand cottage in Nebworth. And then the south, I think this is the south wing of Temple Newsome. I don't know if you're familiar with Temple Newsome. It's a very large country house on the outskirts of Leeds. And the whole of the south wing was converted into a auxiliary hospital run on exactly the same lines as all the other ones we've been talking about. There were 60 of these alone in West Yorkshire, in the surrounding area around Holmfirth. Okay, next slide, please, Sarah. So on the 21st of November, just days after the hospital was officially opened, the first batch of wounded soldiers arrived in Holmfirth, and the hospital was in full swing. By February 1915, they were overwhelmed. The number of beds was increased to 9, and again in May to 15. How they managed to accommodate a doubling in the number of patients in a matter of months in a small terrace house is difficult to picture. And as the flow of wounded continued unabated, by September 1916, pressure for beds was so great that an extension hut was then erected on this very kindly donated free land next door. But the pressure continued. Sorry, go back. So September 1916, pressure for beds was so great that an extension hut was erected in land adjoining the hospital and accommodated another 14 beds and a new dining room. And this was followed almost immediately at the request of the military authorities for a further extension, adding another 25 beds and a recreation room. A final new hut was added in April 1918, providing space for another 20 beds, taking the total to 74. So in 4 years, the hospital had grown from 6 beds to 74 beds. And this image shows the hospital as it stood after the opening of the last hut. So the hospital is here, and then the 3 huts are lined up alongside it, and you can see the number of beds. The first 16 months of its life, the hospital was supported entirely by local fundraising efforts. But in March 1916, it became eligible for grants from the War Office worth 2 shillings per patient per day. Although gratefully received, the 1916 Hospital Annual Report noted, this sum does not by any means cover the cost of carrying on the whole of the work of the hospital, and the report urged continuance of that regular financial support from the community, without which the hospital would not be able to function efficiently. Sometimes these generous benefactors needed a bit of prodding. At a concert to raise funds to cover construction of the hut erected towards the end of 1916, Dr. Trotter, who had replaced the original medical officer, felt obliged to admonish the attendees. He said, allegations made regarding the supposed extravagant administration were far from the mark, and critics were welcome to come and see for themselves how this institution is run. He reminded businessmen present how they had personally profited from the war, especially those in the textile trades, which had benefited from a surge in demand of cloth for uniforms. And Trotter concluded, let such people remember that they owe everything to the men fighting for Britain on land and sea, and if it was necessary to double the size of the hospital tomorrow, the money really ought to come flooding in. Instead, he regretted that money raised from various events, such as the one he was talking at on this occasion, had to be used to pay off debts that were incurred by previous extensions, rather than improving and adding to what was there. He wasn't a happy man. However, perhaps this telling off worked on the opening of the last hut, which is the biggest one on the end here. In April 1918, it was noticed that the whole expense had generously been borne by the people of Holmfirth. The speaker doubted there was any locality in the whole of Yorkshire that had such a record. Trotter confirmed this sentiment, observing that some people had said the new extension was too big an undertaking, but he'd been proved right, and the people of Holmfirth had once again rallied to the support of wounded soldiers. Part of these funds came from bazaars, and this extract on the far right, which I know you won't be able to read, so I'll tell you what it says, came from bazaars that were held on a regular basis, and this particular bazaar was held at the end of May 1918. It raised nearly £2,000 towards the new hut, consisted of stalls selling all sorts of things, vegetables, books, fancies, crockery. There was a dance which raised £10 and concerts which raised £18. And donations and new subscriptions were also encouraged and went into the total sum raised. This was a regular event for raising money for the continuance of the hospital. And it was part of the Holmfirth social round during the war. There were loads and loads and loads of reports in the newspapers about these events happening week, month, day after day. The local newspapers, as in many other towns and villages around the carried the reports of these fundraising events, and they were presided always over by Holmfirth great and good, the mill owners, the businessmen. Next slide, please, Sarah. So finally, let's get to talk about the nurses. When the hospital opened in November 1914, 38 of the 100 women who had gained their first aid certificates signed up straight away, joining the Roberts sisters in their endeavour. These women, with no more than a first aid certificate to their name, under the beady eye of Francis and the medical officer, took care of the wounded soldiers that arrived on their doorstep. In the winter of 1915, Francis and Trotter provided further training for their VADs in home nursing, apparently in response to an order from the War Office in February that year that nursing members should hold certificates in home nursing as well as first aid. That order was actually directed at VADs in military hospitals rather than their auxiliary counterparts. But Roberts and Trotter thought it was a good idea, and the result was that 50 of their members gained this new qualification. As the hospital grew, so did the staff, albeit at a steady-ish rate. The major spurt in staff numbers occurred early in 1918 when an extra 20 or so nurses were recruited, raising the total numbers to 70. So we increased from 40 when we started, slowly 42, 45, 51, and then up to this big jump up to 70 in early 1918, as the effects of the last push were filtering down to the local level, and the building of the last hut was also undertaken, which added 20 beds. Most of the Holmfirth VADs were nursing members. A couple worked in the stores, but the variety of roles seen in other, maybe larger hospitals, didn't exist here. There were no VAD cleaners, kitchen staff, bandage rollers, etc. in the cards. The accounts show payment to a cook and a large laundry bill. implying the laundry was outsourced. But there's no sign of payment to cleaners and bandage rollers, etc. And I think it can be assumed that these duties fell onto the VAD nurse members. As to age, unlike the young 6-year-old that we met earlier, Ruby, the youngest at Holmfirth was 17, which was the youngest for a nursing member. A nursing member had to be 17 or over, while half of the staff were under 30. So it's a very young staff. The eldest was Sarah Marsden, who was 60, and all but 10 of the final staff were single women. So you can imagine that this is all about logistics of fitting your other responsibilities around the work at the hospital. The image top left shows the hospital on the occasion of opening of the hut again, because this is a different picture. Now we've got all the staff sitting outside it. The Roberts sisters, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, they're sitting on the first row, and Emily is the only woman on the left. Frances is the only woman on the right. And in the middle, we have Dr. Trotter and the previous doctor, Dr. Williams, who is now joined up and is a lieutenant colonel. What is really frustrating about this photograph and its caption from the newspaper is the total lack of names for all of the other nurses. There are 44 of them arranged in this photograph and not a single name given to them, which I find really frustrating. And I don't know if you've looked at old nursing material before, but this is typical. You find photographs of, this is the surgeon and his 2 theatre nurses. The surgeon is called this, the theatre nurses don't have names. And it's very frustrating. But there you go. This is typical. Next slide, please, Sarah. So the original 40 VADs were, well, they were all, even when we get up to the 70, they were all a mixed bunch of women. Holmfirth is a relatively well-off town. It's got an economy dominated by textile mills, which generates a lot of revenue. There's an established middle class and a ready supply of wives and daughters of local businessmen keen to make their contribution to the war effort. In addition to the Roberts family, other well-represented families included the Hayes. Mrs. Shawhay took over from Teresa Tinker as treasurer at some point I can't quite identify, and her daughters Kathleen and Mildred enrolled as nurses. The extended Barber family, also mill owners, were represented by 2 generations of their womenfolk. Emmeline was one of the original committee members, while her niece Annie and another relation, Margaret, were nurse members. Similarly, the Butterworths. Annie and Helen were cousins whose fathers ran the family's wool manufacturing business in Holmfirth. So you can see how we've got a nice bunch of middle-class women coming together. They don't have anything to worry about in terms of time. They have time on their hands. They can come and help out in great numbers. But the hospital can't survive on the work of this enthusiastic but relatively small group of middle-class women. And as this slide shows, even though the mills are working at full tilt to keep up with the military's demand for cloth, the working women of Holmfirth still found time to volunteer at the hospital too. I find this fascinating. And as you can see, out of the original 40, we have got 23 mill workers working at the hospital. These 23 women had day jobs in the mills. Sisters Jessie and Cora Sykes, who both worked in the mills, volunteered at the hospital for the duration of the war, the whole duration, as did the Alderson, Booth and Caldwell sisters, all average between 3 and 4 hours a week, spread across the whole time of service. So they don't conform so comfortably with the picture of a typical, comfortable, middle-class VAD woman. For most of these women, their wages were a necessity rather than a luxury. Looking at their entries in the 1911 census, you can see that their siblings are working, their parents are working, perhaps often their fathers are dead. The whole of the family economy depends upon their wage. So the question is, how did they manage to combine volunteering in the hospital with a full-time job? There are 2 hospitals in nearby Brighouse which give us a clue. They also employed working women, and it was noted that they relied mainly on the labour of VADs who could give only 1 day's service a week. So perhaps that's the answer here, that our nurses are doing not 2 or 3 hours a day or 2 or 3 hours a week. They're combining it and maybe only working at the hospital once every 2 weeks. We have enough volunteer nurses for them to be able to do that. Analysis of the number of hours worked at Holmfirth, which was recorded on most of the cards, supports this. While the middle-class VADs averaged 16 hours a week for the full duration of the war, the textile workers averaged 3, as I've already said. Local historian F. Marsh suggests that while daytime nursing was mainly carried out by married ladies or single ladies of independent means, the night shifts were covered by the working women, supervised by a night sister, who was often one of the middle-class VADs, or more frequently, the only professional nurse on staff apart from Frances Roberts, who took the role as night sister. And this was either Nurse Hobart at the beginning of the war, and later on Nurse Costello, who replaced her. Next slide, please, Sarah. Marsh obviously had carried out some sort of an oral history project with people who remembered this time in Holmfirth, because he collected a few stories, which I'm just going to tell you one of today. And this is Elsie Senior. She worked full-time at the mill and came to the hospital in the evenings to take care of patients. She was 22 when she signed up in November 1914, and like most, she stayed for the duration of the war. Elsie was a wool burler. That's somebody who sort of finisher, is fitting the knots out of material once it's been woven. She worked as a wool burler at Wash Pit Mills and lived in Cliff. And I don't know if you can, hopefully this map is big enough and you can see. So Sarah, what's her name? I've forgotten her name. Elsie. She lives right in the top right-hand corner at a place called Cliff, just outside the main centre of Holmfirth. Her place of work, Wash Pit Mill, is right down the bottom, here on the left, on the right-hand side. So every day she walked from her home to Wash Pit. There are no buses in Holmfirth at this stage, and the train's not going to do her any good at all. She walked from Wash Pit, from her home Cliff to Wash Pit in the south of the town. It's a distance of about 1.5 miles. It doesn't sound a lot, but her 7 o'clock start at the mill. Her shift would last 10.5 hours, and after that she walked home again for tea and to change into her uniform before setting off for her evening shift at the hospital, which is also in the south, but over on more towards the southwest of the town. So she's then walks there. She does her shift at the hospital, which starts at 7 o'clock in the evening, and then goes home, walks home again. This grueling 34 hours of non-stop work sounds daunting enough, combined with a journey of close to 5 miles to achieve it. And if this sounds bad enough, consider her surroundings. Look at the contour lines. Perhaps you can see the contour lines better on this map. You can see them, they're all very close together down here and still going up the hill further away. The centre of Holmfirth is, I don't know if you've ever been there, it's in the base of a valley. Either side are steep hills. And as Marsh says, to get to any of the surrounding areas of the centre of Holmfirth is like climbing a mountainside every time. So this is not just a nice stroll down a river path that she's doing. And this must have been typical working pattern for all of the mill girls who volunteered at the hospital. And even if they only did it once a week, it was a considerable ask. According to her card, Elsie contributed 972 hours, or an average of about 5 hours a week for the whole period of the war, which suggests she may not have undertaken this mammoth task every week, but it is an indication of the dedication and determination of the mill women to make a contribution to the cause. Next slide, please, Sarah. And now we've got another map, and I hope you can see some of this. What I was trying to show here was, I've shown you Elsie, she's just one case. I want to show that she wasn't the only person. So this is a larger map of Holmfirth, but still not large enough to be able to include all of the places that the nurses came from. And all the yellow tags around the edge show you directions to other places that people lived. Shows the locations of the VADs. Annie Thieker worked as a bookkeeper at a woolen mill. She lived in Honley. Now, Honley is right above the top. We couldn't begin to fit Honley onto this map. It's sort of northwest of Holmfirth. She worked at the bookkeeper and she lived at Honley and therefore had a nearly 4-mile journey to the hospital from her home. Annie she had one of the longest journeys. And I don't know where she worked, so I can't tell you the same detail that I told you about Elsie. But even if she has no means of transport, an 8-mile round trip from your home to the hospital to do a night shift, which is probably what she did, is a bit of a stretch. I'm not sure why she worked at Holmfirth, because Honley had its own auxiliary hospital that opened a bit later in the war, so maybe she was already ensconced at Holmfirth and didn't want to move. But anyway, I would have done, save a 4-mile walk each way. As this map indicates, a large number of the VADs did not live in Holmfirth itself, but in the surrounding villages. All of these women gave the hospital their time freely. The only paid members were, as I said before, the cook and a masseur who was paid, so came in once a month or so to help out. Virtually all of them who signed up in 1914 stayed throughout the war, only 4 left. I can't find any information on one of these, but the other 3 followed a route much sought after by adventurous VADs, and they were able to secure transfers to military hospitals, possibly with the idea of eventually making it to France. There are lots of examples in the archives of women begging to be sent abroad. To such an extent, there was a waiting list for overseas postings, and the Joint War Committee turned many of them down repeatedly, reminding them that the work in home hospitals was just as important as the work overseas. And this plan to get closer to the action may have been the factor which caused our intrepid 3, Annie Barber, Mary Seddon, and Mabel Boothman, to leave the safety of home for bigger things. Annie was the only one to make it to France. She's the unmarried daughter of local textile manufacturer, of course, and joined Holmfirth Hospital in early 1915, where she stayed until the end of that year. It looks like Annie was keen to deploy the skills she had picked up in Holmfirth on a bigger stage, and she successfully negotiated a transfer to the 5th Northern General Hospital in Leicester in January 16. And in mid-17, having honed her skills even further in a busy military hospital, she must have applied for a transfer to France, and she was successful. She remained in France until January 1919, when she was discharged. I have no details of what she did in France, unfortunately. Mary Seddon was born and raised in Holmfirth, unmarried daughter of a local farmer. She worked as a confectioner before the war. She's another one who did an amazing amount of work. Whether she continued as a confectioner, I doubt, because she did 18 hours a week on average in the 2 years that she was at the hospital. And I'm sort of assuming if she did continue as a confectioner, she did it at home and fit it around her. She didn't have another walk somewhere else. She lived at Thongs Bridge, which is still quite a distance, a couple of miles from the hospital, and had quite a journey. At the end of 1917, she successfully obtained a transfer to Tidworth, which was a large military hospital in Salisbury Plain, where she worked full-time until she left in June 1918, just before the end of the war. I don't know why. Mabel Tinkle also started her career at Holmfirth in November 1914, and research indicates her whole family worked in the textile mills as operatives. In April 1916, Mabel married a Leeds man, Ernest Boothman, who had recently enlisted in the West Yorkshire Regiment, and it looks like theirs was one of those quick war marriages. Ernest was posted overseas to Malta the day after their wedding. And several months later, Mabel, now a young wife, abandoned her home and work in Holmfirth to take up a full-time post at the Kitchener Hospital in Brighton. Quite how she ended up in Brighton, I don't know. There were lots of large military hospitals she could have gone to much closer. Perhaps she was feeling that if she went to the South Coast, she was somehow a bit closer to her husband, or maybe she was just sent there. I don't know. Whatever reason, she spent some time at Kitchener and then was transferred to another hospital in Brighton, the Pavilion. When Ernest was demobbed in January 1919 and Mabel in February, they settled in Leeds, where Ernest picked up his pre-war trade. But when war threatened once again, Mabel renewed her spirit from World War I, rejoining the Red Cross as a member of the Women's Auxiliary Red Cross Service. Next slide, please, Sarah. There's not much known about the daily routines of the VADs at Holmfirth. One surviving source is the night book for December 1916 to May 1918, which records brief nightly record signed off by the night sister. The details tend to confirm patients were mainly convalescent, certainly no indication of major emergencies during the night. The work involved dealing with pain, limbs, swollen limbs and faces, administering aspirin, fomentations, hot water bottles, whiskey, tea, and serving breakfast. Presumably day nurses followed a similar mix of duties, replacing breakfast with tea and lunch. It's plausible they also undertook a lot of cleaning at night. An instruction in the night book for one shift states nurses to do out the nurses' sitting room. The entry on this page, to the right of the night book, records that Percival Woodhead caused a great disturbance to the men in the ward, tearing the linoleum considerably by pulling the beds about and making lights in the ward after they'd been extinguished. There were many other incidents logged in the night book, but on the whole, the most frequent comment was simply, all patients seemed comfortable and slept well, no complaints. Matron Roberts would have been disappointed to see any reports of complaints and misbehaviour. She was known as a strict disciplinarian, ruling the hospital with extreme firmness. Apparently, her ultimate threat for misbehaving patients was to send them back to Royds Hall, which was where they come from, the large, frenetic, impersonal military hospital in Huddersfield. So that's what they were threatened with, and none of them wanted to go back to Royds Hall. So that's a very condensed view. Can I have the next slide, please, Sarah, and my last slide? I hope I've shown through this sort of analysis of the women working in one small hospital that this sort of work can reveal a view of VADs that differs significantly from that portrayed in most histories. It emphasises the community aspect of the hospital and sheds light on the determination of remote communities to do their bit during the war. Unobtrusive they may have been in the eyes of the Joint War Committee, but in places like Holmfirth, they represented civic pride. The women came from much more diverse backgrounds than has been suggested elsewhere, and it's been particularly of interest to discover the mill women. I leave you with these images of more of the hospital's nurses and patients, again, completely unnamed, so I don't know who they are. But ask you to look, if you can see it, yes you can, in this image, look past the hospital to its surroundings, and what you see in the background is a very steep hill. These steep hillsides dominate the features, the landscape, which surrounds Holmfirth town today. And if you think, well, walking a few miles a day is not such a great deal, look again at the terrain and consider this. Would you have been prepared to do this in any weather, before and after a long night shift, and only after your factory shift, another long walk to look forward to? Thank you.
Okay, so just about as we close, we'd like to really thank Sue. I think we all found it really interesting. I know I learned things that I never knew. I can't believe nursing support workers go back so far. It's interesting that they are not the forgotten workforce, but probably unseen and not known about much, because I didn't know about them. Yes. And actually in 2024, nursing support workers are still the forgotten workforce and the unseen workforce. So that's really quite interesting, I find. So thank you so much, Sue. It's much appreciated that you came and spoke to us today. So could you just possibly take a moment to complete the short evaluation forms that are on your tables? The link will be posted in the chat for the people on Zoom. And we'll leave the online meeting open for a few more minutes so people will have time to click on the evaluation link. But please feel free to leave as soon as you have done that. Can I just thank you again as part of the Nursing Support Worker Committee to come in today. And if any of you want to know about what we do and how we can help you if you're a nursing support worker, please do get in touch with us, because we are here as your voice, and we can't be a voice if you don't tell us what you want us to do. All right, so thank you so much. Thank you.